Welcome to the FMCG Guys, the podcast that dives into the innovation, strategy, and trends shaping consumer goods and retail in Europe and beyond.
Welcome to the FMCG Guys podcast. I'm Daniel Torres. If this is the first time you tune in, you'll want to know we're likely the largest consumer goods and retail podcast in Europe. It's not me that says it. It's our over 25,000 LinkedIn followers. And if you didn't know, we're also part of a family of podcasts, we have a sister podcast in the US called the CPG Guys, they've been interviewing people since 2020. We've been around since 22. And they've interviewed over, I think it's 500 episodes. We are at 270, so nearly there. And today, I'm very excited about the chat we have. We have excellent people on the podcast, and there is no exception. I think that the exception is that we've chased him for a few months before getting him finally on the hot seat, and it's no other than Bastien Parizot, who's the Senior Vice President, IT and Digital, Marketing and Transformation, and also Chief Information and Digital Officer, Emerging Markets at Reckitt. Bastien, did I get this right?
You get the longest title ever, absolutely right, and I can explain a bit later, of course.
It was quite the challenge. I'm glad I got it well. Bastien, can you tell me a bit about how you got to this long title? What did you do in your career prior?
Sure. So I have about 20 years of experience in multiple industries and in a few roles. When I say multiple industries, maybe I could mention three. So I spent all of my early career in the sports industry. When I say sports, people tend to think of entertainment or like with the football club and so on. It's not as exciting as that, but at least for me it was. I've worked for a retailer called Decathlon that I'm sure everybody knows in Europe and starts in the US.
I think most people will know Decathlon. Are they in the US as well or not?
So they tried for a few years a long time ago, and then it didn't work out for many reasons. And they actually started to come back, I think, only a few years back as well in Canada and the US, where the market's quite different. So I continued in sports for a few years in a company called Hammer Sports. It's holding groups of a lot of brands that people would know. Salomon Skiing, Arc'teryx, nice jackets, although quite expensive, quite nice. And a couple of other brands. And then I decided to shift to CPG, started at Nestlé. Based in Switzerland. It was very, very nice. I did a quick turn in automotive for 2 years, very quick. And at Renault in Paris, which was part of the Renault-Nissan Alliance. And I came back to CPG, where I absolutely love working in CPG or FMCG. At Reckitt, and Reckitt is manufacturing, selling brands like Durex, Vanish, Nurofen, Dettol, Finish, a lot of household brands that people would know of.
Absolutely. I would say on the premium part of household brands in terms of like the quality and also the pricing in terms of the positioning, it is on that end. And you spent, so basically I think that you grew up in France and then spent most of your career in France, but then you lived in Switzerland, and I think you lived in Italy for a bit even, no?
Yeah, so I usually don't mention that part of my career because it was so early on, but I did start my career by trying to create an internet startup. And it tells you a lot of the times because I say internet and I don't say something more fancy than that. Because at the time, internet was still a new thing.
So it was still fancy?
Yeah, exactly. So I did that in part in Italy, in Firenze, and part in the east of France where we get public and private funding actually at the time. So trying to recreate a bit of, if people know Yelp in the US, we're trying to do that at the time for France and Europe.
Now you've been living in London for the last, 3 years so?
Yeah.
Actually coming to 4 years, no?
Yeah, it's coming to 4 years end of the year, living in West London with the family, and absolutely love it.
Nice. Yeah, there's always a bit of rivalry, obviously, between London and Paris. So if you had to choose, which one would you take?
I am not from Paris. I am from the Alps, so I would choose London over Paris anytime you ask.
Well, I'm the other way around. And sorry for our UK audience. It's the main country that listens to us, but I have to say I do prefer Paris to London. But it is what it is. What it is. I like the English pubs, I have to say. Um, uh, Obviously, I think Bastien, my background is in recruitment. I spent a lot of years recruiting people in consumer goods and retail, like sports and fashion and so on. So I know the industries very well. And that especially in the commercial, apart from supply chain, probably, you normally have a lot of people going from FMCG to retail and fashion. But on the other way around, it's pretty rare. What was like how was your experience with that when you joined Nestle back in the day, coming from Emma Sports?
So listen, that's a great one, and I can see what you're saying as well. You see a lot of movements the opposite way. I was blessed enough to be able to work in what was my point of passion. I grew up in the Alps doing skiing and outdoor sports, and so I was so lucky to be able to work for companies, brands close to that. And I launched direct to consumer there. So I was also lucky to have basically being able to touch on every type of activities. I'm sure we come to that a few moments in the conversation. I was drawn by moving to CPG by the idea of trying to apply some of what I was doing, performance marketing, very close to consumers, trying to personalize a lot to consumer with a lot of depth in data, and trying to apply some of that in a world where it's most like you keep hearing about how do you learn how to build a brand. This only happens in CPG, or you hear that in P&G, you hear that in Nestle, you hear that across a lot of companies, and you don't have such a structured way of looking at brands in other parts of the industry. And so I was drawn by learning that and getting into that world with the intent of trying to apply some of my, let's say, personalization skills, data, close to the consumer, performance marketing to that world of reach and frequency, mass media, building brands this way. And so this is what took me over on the other side. And yeah, what I saw, I loved it. The diversity you get in FMCG or in CPG at large is I don't think you get that in a lot of industries, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I think it's also the level of sophistication that you have in a lot of parts of the business, right? It's like super granular, which I think in retail and fashion, I think everything is more less sophisticated to a point, maybe because they don't need to be as sophisticated. I think that you build like a brand and you create an aura around it, and then you just go to market. It's, I think, more like go to market. And in FMCG, it all becomes like you really study your competitors, you really study your customers, your consumers, like really to like a lot of detail. Maybe sometimes even too much detail. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. For me, the what I saw and what I really love in FMCG is the attention brought to consumer insights and research. I think it's something, you're right. It's maybe a little bit far away from how you build that in retail or in industries like luxury and so on. The attention that is being provided here is really out of this world. The second thing I mentioned, diversity. Honestly, diversity of just being a global company. I think the sophistication you mentioned is also coming from the number of markets you operate into, the vast amount of brands that we usually have in the FMCG business, and how fast the disruptions are also coming at you. If you think of global supply chain, if you think of digital, AI, data, many other disruptions, to sustain your performance in such a world, I think the FMCG companies are really at the forefront of getting those challenges. I think I'd say as well, it's probably a game of it's probably a result of how the margin setup is also being done for those different industries. I don't think FMCG have any other choices but to be the most sophisticated or at least very advanced because of how margins are being operated in that world as well.
Yeah, totally. Is there any like culture shock that you got from joining Nestle from Emma?
So the size of it, and I think it's probably not only the difference of industries, but also the company itself has different culture, because I could talk about Nestle, Renault, and then going to Reckitt. But the size and the scale is probably the one I would mention the most. The complexity of the landscape in which FMCG operates, both from distribution as well as from a global footprint, is also, I found, maybe the most, maybe not shocking, but the most surprising, or the biggest learning curve, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, also like in the two FMCGs that you've been in, it's both been at headquarters, right? These are normally the places where you get more the sensation of like complexity, diversity, and so on. But by the way, also looking at your LinkedIn, you've done, like I normally say, there's like a sexy side of digital and a non-sexy side of digital. The sexy side is like the commercial, direct to consumer, etc., and the non-sexy is like IT, data. So your titles at Amer Sports were very commercial, but then you look a bit more into details and you mention IT, merchandising, but then you go to Nestle and you go into data, consumer engagement, and personalization. And what you're doing now is very like back end, which was traditionally a non-sexy part, but maybe now I actually no, maybe no, no. Now it is becoming much more sexy. But what's the journey been like?
Yeah, it's so I've never seen. It's a very funny one. I think now sexy and non-sexy are coming together because they have to, and because the technology is actually blurring the lines across what you used to go as business, its function, and its tech. I actually don't think it's so easy now to separate all of those three. Uh, from my personal perspective, I've never seen myself as only belonging to one. I've always seen myself of sitting in a function, sitting in a team, and then from that angle, looking at what's the broadest impact I could bring. This said, I have always been looking at what you would call the non-sexy stuff. I mean, if I look back in my days of launching direct to consumer, I literally had a phone when we started on my desk taking consumer calls. I spent most of my days in the warehouses to make sure we're setting up operations as well. So I think every job has both parts. But when you think of, I think the separation you're making is business and IT, maybe, or function and IT. I think that line is getting blurrier and blurrier. And I actually enjoy being on either side of it, but making sure that the impacts comes together. And for me, moving to IT and digital, which is where I sit today, still enables me to support marketing, support innovation, enable sales, and have an impact, while sitting where you have a deep integration with the core systems of the company, which means you're into the processes that are really at the back of everything. Yeah, the opportunity to impact everything that is foundational, so that in turn you can innovate in a more meaningful way, for me is super important.
Why do you think you've always been able to sit in the middle of the two? Because you know that's what you like to do. And I think the way that you describe it makes a lot of sense, but most times they're pretty separate, these two things.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very hard one to answer, because at least for me personally, because I've always enjoyed more about the business objective, the learning curve, and the impact you can make. And I didn't really care as much as where I was doing that. And I think for me, where you sit is a mean to get it done. So if it's a time where it's better to be driving change through technology, it might sound a little bit opportunistic, and it might be, but in the end, if it has an impact, it has an impact. But for me, sitting in IT doesn't mean that I shouldn't be working hand in hand with marketing. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't be working hand in hand with sales. So I don't know why I've been finding that comfortable, but I've always enjoyed being at the crossroads to liaise those two together. And I think if we keep separating technology, function, business, I don't think we're really leveraging every resources that you have into a given company here. So I'm probably not answering your question, but that's
No, you are. I mean, I guess it also takes some compromise on the ego at some point, no? Because like you have to be able to be flexible on what parts you own and what parts you don't, no?
That's true. That's a really good one. And every time I talk to someone, on the first year I joined Reckitt, when I was like officially with an IT and digital title versus like being sitting in marketing, I've had a lot of people asking me like, why did you move on the dark side, right? And I actually think, I mean, joke aside, I actually think it's I don't think it's that much of a relevant question, especially when careers are so flexible now, moving left and right. Nobody has a clue of the titles they're going to get in 2 or 3 years. Into my line of work, of course, it's you're going to a GM career perspective. It's still quite structured into many companies. But so I think if you don't really care about the titles, therefore you have such a long title as mine in the end, what's really important is what you do and can you enable your company to do something different.
And what's behind your long title? What do you actually do?
So I look after a few things. So I sit into IT and digital. I work very closely with a couple of leaders at Reckitt. One is around everything that has to go with commercial innovation, so really enabling marketing R&D through technology. And so it takes a different shape and flavor now as I'm really doing a big program around how AI can do that. And the other one is actually, and that's the transformation word related to AI. The other one is allowing me to have more breadth across everything that IT can represent in execution, which is really looking after everything technology and IT into our area that is called Emerging Markets, which is the biggest area for Reckitt. And that's great because I can touch on foundations like manufacturing, supply, which is really the backbone of the company. And at the same time, try to connect the dots with how functions can really enable those foundations to work even better.
Definitely. And when it comes to like the internal, like the commercial innovation, how, because there's so much opportunity or so much noise to a point, like how do you like differentiate and like prioritize what's important and what's not? And like, because you could be like doing everything and you could be doing nothing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean the short answer of that is that every company has a finite amount of resources to actually invest, and it's especially more true when you're going through such a transformation that Reckitt is going through. And so the name of the game is really like invest bigger in fewer key initiatives. So if you think AI can change the game for you, if you think the backbone of your company sits in manufacturing and in supply, if you think that you need to enable your labs and R&D to work beautifully, then you need to really have strong and challenging conversations into making sure you invest there. And it takes in turn that you look at where you can massively simplify to actually be able to invest there, for instance. So you could do a lot. You could invest 100 initiatives. But really the name of the game is making sure in technology specifically that has a little bit of time to land the value as well, is that you invest your 100 in 10. And that takes a level of conversation to agree on priorities internally that is challenging, but actually very valuable.
Yeah. And how do you link it to like business objectives?
It should start from there. And so this is what you were saying about ego and so on before. I'm not the one to say where the business should go, but I'm the one to ask in my current line of work. I'm the one to ask about a lot of questions about where business goes so that I understand it. And then I can help prioritize where we should invest in tech. So if I'm taking examples, if a market like India, for instance, we need to go after a lot, thousands of small stores in rural areas. That's the name of the game for the business. Then asking all kinds of questions around how does it work? How do we unlock that value? What are the challenges that prevents us from doing that today? Then it's my job to go and find the right tech to enable that. Whether it's distributed through distributed networks, whether it's through local distributors, it's really my job to actually go and find the tech that can work here or that equips our sales staff with a mobile phone that can get them to go to distributors, that can get them to go to small stores, that enables a level of self-serve into some of those really remote areas we never visit. And that's the exciting part of it. If you have the business objective, my job is to turn that into an enabler.
And do you typically meet with both markets, the market that you're responsible for, but also like in a global level with the different functions and understand a bit what their needs are and make a bit of a business case? Does it typically work like that or?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you are on the 270 something podcast, so you probably know how it works by now.
Well, and imagine all the recruitment calls I did in my career, right?
And yeah, exactly. So
That's
you've
the
heard
real
that.
base. That's my real data lake.
You probably heard that 1,000 times. It usually works with a business case. I would say in business cases and driving priorities in investment, if I simplify to the extreme in my line of work in tech, you usually see two pieces. One that is perhaps harder to find a business case for it, which is more around compliance foundations, that it's kind of, you have to do it for the business. And one way is like, where do you invest for the next 1, 2, 3 years? And of course, right now it's all about AI and data. And here for sure, you look both internally and externally, where are your best chances to make a difference? So are you making a biggest difference by investing more into developing capabilities for enabling revenue growth with our retailers in the US? Or are you investing more to actually look how you change internally ways of working and enable efficiencies, for instance? So usually we go it this way. And of course, with the business evolving, it's actually quite challenging to follow through, but that's what we're trying to do.
You mentioned ways of working. It's interesting. Like companies might probably find themselves that like technology is going in one direction, but at the same time, hierarchies and ways of working are going into another one. No, and when it comes like to HR, digitalization, does it make a difference, or is it more like a cultural shift, really? And
I think most of it is cultural or people or processes, right? And we use we've stolen a concept from one of our partner when we talk about such innovative disruptions. Like again, I'm going to take AI, right, which I love, which is 70-20-10. And so, and sometimes it's hard to say for someone working in tech, but 10% of the change is coming from the tech, 20% is coming from the data, which is particularly true in a CPG or in FMCG world, compared to retailer where they have direct access to a lot of depth of data and so on. So it's particularly true that there's a lot of harmonization, simplification to be had on data, but still 70% always remain in, let's say, what you would call politely change management, but actually that revolves around ways of working, people, culture, and mindset. And culture and mindset is always something where it's a balancing act, because for me, you don't want to go and change everything. You want to grab what is really working great into a company from the culture perspective. So that in Reckitt, we have this great entrepreneurship mindset, people really feeling accountable for their P&Ls, feeling responsible for the execution. And that's what you want to keep. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you can land transformations globally that make an impact for the long term as well. So this is always a balancing act here.
yeah, and what about marketing? Because that's also a very interesting area where we've seen a kind of return to nostalgia of like old school marketing, but also there's a lot of people that are like obsessed with data and so on. So
Yeah, so I mean, I've been working in marketing as well, and only like leading some of the media space for a while. Same, I think it's never black and white. I think the people, but if you have to separate it, when you say people, good old marketing, there's a lot of stuff that I keep from my Nestle days, where brand building the Nestle way was fantastic in plenty of aspects. So if you look at what makes a good consumer and customer insights, if you look at what is your brand persona or whatever it's being called, the big ID, there's plenty of things that fundamentals, I would call them, I don't think will change. You can bring the amount of tech you want. I don't think they will fundamentally change. I think what's changing is the way you're doing things. And without being obsessed with data, it's more about of where do you want to leverage it for the best, and where do you actually want to make sure that you understand really your categories, your brands, and your markets, that you don't bother wasting your energy into things that are not necessary. I mean, if I look back at my days of running media, a few years back, we've had so much so much time, so many hours spent on looking at the most complex ad tech landscape and how you look at how you operate with your agencies, with tech partners, and so on. In the end of the day, if you have a low involvement, high involvement categories, it's not the same. If you have a direct connection with consumers, it's not the same. So I think there's a bit of a fit for purpose on how sophisticated you want to go into the marketing landscape. And I actually think we've lost that for a few years. But now I think we've reached a good balance around data, creative media, where the ecosystem starts to be a bit simplified. That was before AI was a sticker on everything. And an agency, advertisers and tech partners are coming to the table at the same time to try and make sense of it.
You mentioned India as a very complex ad tech space.
Yeah, I mean, the ad tech space have become incredibly complex over the years. I actually think we've reached the peak of complexity a few years back, and I feel that we've reached a space where now at least there's more transparency to it because advertisers have been pushing for it, and therefore the choices around simplifying the landscape have come on the table.
Okay, interesting. We actually had recently on the podcast a debate between the leading ad tech player and one of the competitors. It was very interesting between Criteo and Pentaleap.
Oh, and so was the what do you think that actually the landscape is becoming even more complex?
Well, definitely in the retail media space, between the fragmentation of different players and the appearance of different solutions of ad tech, the fact is that now they're all growing, right? I think that then later we'll see which models work better and which ones work worse as well.
I think it's a fantastic point. And so maybe the caveat to what I say is that where the media landscape was not mature yet, we see this increasing complexity and fragmentation. I would mention here, retail and creative tech are actually becoming complex for me because they are not at the same level of maturity as how traditional media and digital media was.
Yeah.
But I think it's getting quite fast there.
Yeah. What about, you mentioned AI as a super exciting place. What are you doing around it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exciting for everyone. We're doing a few things, but we took so AI first. There's a lot of talks around it because Gen AI came. But I think many companies like us have been doing traditional AI for a while. It's just that it's harder to grasp what is actually being done in traditional AI because it's, machine learning models and things that are less visible. So if you think of AI as a combination of AI and Gen AI, what we're doing is that we took a choice to go after reinventing our internal work processes with it. We see that as we're going through major transformation, with a divestiture of our business plus simplifying how we operate, we're seeing AI as a way to enable that. And so what we're doing is that we're transforming the ways we work in marketing. We started there. We're doing that in R&D and probably we'll go to other functions. And so the aim is simply to think of where do we spend a lot of time, we collectively internally, so community of marketers or people in regulatory and safety, for instance, where do we spend a lot of time that we think would be better invested to doing other things or would be optimized? And then what we're doing here is creating or like partnering for AI solutions that are trying to cover for that. So to give you two examples to make it practical, one is if you think of the idea to concept, it's taking a lot of time from ideation process to getting to product concept. And so while you need a lot of humans into the process here, we felt that we could help our marketers to iterate a lot more and do it a lot faster. And so we're enabling them now with, we're augmenting them with AI solutions to actually do that. So instead of spending weeks on iterating 20 product concepts, now they can do it in a matter of days by accessing every point of data that we have at Reckitt. And they can do that. On another practical example, you're also thinking of like how you look at your brand performance, right? And you want to do it consistently. You want to do it in a simple way. You don't want all of your brand teams to spend days into crunching data and writing different reports that is slightly different every time. And so why not adding an AI solution that creates the outputs already, connecting automatically all the data, providing you a first level of recommendation, and then helping you to make better decisions. So that's what we're doing as in Reckitt right now with AI.
When you mention brand performance, is that just seeing how the brand is doing and across markets and so on from a global perspective?
So it's not only from global, so it needs to be practical here. So the aim is really to help the markets to, and like teams on the ground to have practical outputs from AI. And so while it's a learning curve and learning journey for everyone, we're only at 10% of the journey a year. I'll be the first one to say that. It's really enabling them to first make sure that the data that they used to collect is already collected automatically. If you think of collecting IQVIA and Nielsen data together, if you start to have like other levels of like your monitor and so on that you want to append to that, why not simplifying that life of doing it every single month for every single brand, for every single retailer? And then it's trying to combine all of that in a way that gives pointers where to look at, that gives a few insights that triggers the right conversation for the business. And so that's what I'm talking about. So it's actually less globally to monitor where the business is at. It's more for one brand team in the UK or in Spain to look at the performance of their brand, the 4P drivers, performance by retailers, subsegments, being able to deep dive into different cuts of data in a more flexible way.
And is that like an aspiration or it's something that's really happening now already?
It's something that we currently deploying, and we've currently deployed to maybe about 600 users now, a few hundred users, and to all of the trade marketing community by end of the year.
How do the commercial folk normally react to these innovations? Is there like a degree of resistance or skepticism, or is it more like, oh, thank God you're giving me this tool because it's going to save me a lot of time?
So it's a funny one. I've discussed a lot internally and externally. Maybe there's two parts to it. The first one is one would expect that you actually have a lot of resistance, and I was actually quite surprised personally of how low the resistance was, or how positive people were about trying to bring AI into a practical lens for participating to the day-to-day. And I think maybe one thing has to go with this is that AI is not going to go away. I think we can safely say that is going to be embedded across everything that we do, and bring it in a practical way within an existing or an adjusted process is probably the best you can do for everyone personally to have a learning journey with AI as well. Because you don't necessarily have the time to go on your own and do the learning and education and so on. So that's probably the best way to have it. The second one I would say is that people have been very helpful into actually making us understand what value we should bring with it. And so one would call it a challenge, but in the world where you build capabilities, this is actually exactly what you want. You want a community of very demanding users. And so the commercial teams have been very helpful in that sense. And maybe the last piece, I'd say two, but actually three. The last piece is that depending on your intent, if you want to bring it in a practical way to people executing the strategies on the ground, you would see potentially a way or expectations being different at a more senior level versus where actually people are being enabled to use the solutions. And so if you tell someone, an assistant brand manager, that he or she won't have to crunch numbers for 3 days before writing a report anymore, usually you get a warm welcome. If you showcase the same to someone that is a little bit higher up or leading a lot more across the markets, maybe the output could be looking like I had higher expectations from AI that is built up by the world outside.
Or if I've hired someone in the team, it's because I want them to do it, no? Not AI.
Yeah, potentially, although it means that in turn you can demand a lot more from like business insights and drivers of decisions here.
That's true. I mean, and clearly, like it's changing the ways of working already. What about like, do you think that leaders will have to act differently? Like people that have like a lot of direct reports, or even like, well, not necessarily even a small team. Do you think it will have like an effect on like the type of effective leadership, or leadership is leadership? And
it's a great question. and I don't have foresight about what's going to happen in the future, but I would say part of what you say is true. Leadership is leadership. And so the way you drive your teams to learn, the way you invite them to lean in when there's something new, the way that you orchestrate things to make sure that it has an impact will probably never change, right? The how your teams will take everything that you're bringing to them and execute with it is going to change massively. So I think leaders have also to lean in understanding how AI or new technologies, but I'm going to say AI for now, is going to impact the ways of working, how it's going to impact the access to knowledge. And that point is very important. And how it's going to impact the way that this knowledge is being, I like to say that, codified into the solutions. So what we've been spending a lot of time as an example to that is looking at what we know and the context that we have. So called tacit knowledge, right? And so really looking inward for a leader, really thinking hard about the fundamentals of their brands and what is the tacit knowledge that they want never to disappear, even when you can have solutions or those magical agents that we hear about that will do everything for us, is the most important part. And I think while leadership soft skills won't change, the way leaders need to approach how those technologies are disrupting their ways of working needs to happen right now.
Yeah. And speaking about a very specific leader, how has it, do you think, in hindsight, affected you? I mean, also, it's not like a completely fair assessment, because also that's gone in parallel with you, like having more years of leadership. So this, unless you're a very stubborn person that won't make a good leader, you will kind of like change your leadership style or improve. But do you think that technology's had a role in that? In the way that you manage your people, interact with your people?
I think so. And if I look back over the years since I've been lucky enough to be leading teams, I think it has evolved towards a lot more. I know people have been using servant leaders and so on, like whatever is the name for it, but a lot more being in the back and enabling the teams and realizing that leadership is really not about always calling the shots, always making the decision, and always leading by telling what is the vision all the time. You need to write it. You need to jointly write it with your team, but then it's more about leaning in the back. And the reason why is that I do think technology has enabled people to go a lot faster, to access a lot more knowledge. And if you think of the pure math of that, and you have like 10 direct reports, and then they have their directs and they have their teams. If you think of yourself as the leader who needs to know everything, who needs to lead everything, the math just don't add up. It's impossible to do that. So for me, it's more about being more open to ideas coming up to you, being more open to let go of things as well, because they can get executed by the teams. You don't need to know about everything. You need to have the right oversight and controls in place to make sure that you have a freedom in a box. But then I think it has enabled the teams to be a lot more independent. I actually love it.
Yeah. Also, kind of gives you a good context to give teams more empowerment and to let them take more decisions, no? Because information is power at the end of the day. I mean, and that's the thing, like, if you struggle with not being the person that knows everything, you'll have a problem with that. But if you're a person that prefers to empower the teams, I think it's a good context to give that empowerment, no?
I agree. I personally, I'm a person who I'm been enjoying all of my jobs because it was always a learning curve. And if you like learning, like many other leaders out there and many other people out there, working this way with your team is bringing you a lot, because most often have a lot of team members coming to me with new ideas, with new ways of executing. And it's always a learning curve for me. And I think also the access to knowledge for me is an important point. If you think of knowledge in three ways, right? Data that is already available. Now with large language models, you have access to unstructured data. So what was sitting in a PDF, now it becomes data as well, knowledge. And then the third one, which is if companies like us start to capture the tacit knowledge, the way that the company is looking at things, it means that knowledge is instantly accessible for everyone across the globe. So distributing the work the access to knowledge and the capacity to innovate actually a lot further for me.
Do you find that like people in your team have not naturally that previous position of being proactive, giving their ideas and so on? Or, well, actually, this is not a dichotomy, but well, that's the one part. And secondly, how do you encourage people to be proactive and come and manage their function, their job as if it were their own business, independently of what you have to say?
Yeah, so I think I like this concept of freedom in a box. If you're able to write a vision and ambition that is well articulated, and that is articulated over more than 6 months, you can then in turn provide some constraints for it because the world is constrained. And then it gives people the empowerment to work into that freedom in the box. And I see that a lot. The second one I'd say is, I think it's part from the Reckitt culture as well. People have a natural tendency to come up with ideas and to try and do new things, which is fantastic. And I'm seeing that a lot. And now with tools available, it's a good mix of, it enables us to do a lot more things a lot faster, but there's a little bit of frustration as well because people are seeing the tools and everything that is the art of the possible in the outside world. And for sure, when you're in an enterprise, it's a little more constrained. So the question is, how do you expand that freedom in the box so that people enjoy their work and that it's still going to the direction that you've said?
Yeah, because it's pretty easy to get FOMO, no, in this time of AI of, oh, I saw this company doing this and that.
I was presenting to a non-compete company last week, and that was one of my title on the slide, which is the worst enemy of what's happening on AI and data is actually FOMO, because it turns you into this team or company trying to chase the latest of the latest, which you'll never be able to because the acceleration and the pace at which things are going are not enterprise level. And we should not care that much about that. We should not care about being a tech company. We're an FMCG or we're CPG, right? If I talk collectively here. And so we should look at what's the best application at the right scale, at the right level of intelligence that we should apply to our processes and to our business. And we should be happy with that.
Yeah. There's a certain retail fashion company that said they wanted to be a tech company a few years ago, but I think that's changed a little bit internally in the last few months.
And I can only wish for everyone claiming that to succeed, but it reminds me, it brings me back in the days where I was in sports. And we have for 3-4 years, everyone claiming they would become a service and tech company. And we had Adidas buying mobile apps, tracking your sport. We did same acquisition in my company as well. We saw Under Armour doing that. And the reality is that in the end, all of that is or should be directed to driving a better business outcome for your core business. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, like how much do you think that a CEO should be involved in tech?
I'd say right now, probably more than yesterday, because I think there's tech and tech. And what we're seeing right now, there's no debating that, again, coming back to AI, it is disrupting, or it will disrupt literally every piece of the value chain that we have to operate. So I'd say right now, probably more than yesterday. I'd say a lot when it comes to what's the application for a company, for its processes, the impact on the workforce. And so avoiding being locked with a cloud partner, for instance, is one example, but not that much trying to be a tech-first company. And so I think for the rest, that's it. And then it depends on personal passion point. But I think those should be the 2 points of focus. The impact on what it should have on the industry and the company should be the primary focus for them. But knowing too much about the tech and the latest trends and so on is potentially helpful, but potentially giving you that sense of FOMO and that you're not doing enough.
And we've all heard stories about big bosses, hearing about the latest tech thing and making a whole team. And it can very easily like go down in a fake, like 1,000 people trying to like find a use case for some technology that somebody senior has seen somewhere.
And it's been the case in multiple angles, and I could name I could list at least tens of examples where it has happened, and maybe some of them I've done it as well, because we're all trying multiple things and not everything is succeeding. But yeah, I think it's important to stay focused on the core business fundamentals.
Agreed. By the way, another, you talked about impact, something that I think now is a bit out of vogue, but I know that all consumer goods companies are working around, partly because of a regulation as well as sustainability. How do you think tech can support that mission?
So this is actually a fantastic opportunity to leverage tech. And I've worked on sustainability tech for a year and a half at Reckitt, setting up some capabilities there. And I think when you think of tech data at large, being able to process large volumes of data from tens or hundreds of sources to apply your data, and probably if you think of ESG at large, like even employee data and all this, of course, under all strict rules. This tech is a fantastic opportunity to actually leverage it for better. So one example that comes to my mind is that we've worked with a company called CO2 AI that is helping us actually analyzing all data related to carbon footprint, and helping us to look at what changes could we make into our value chain, what changing could you make into raw materials, what changes could you make into how one product is being manufactured into different sites. And so everything that has an impact on your carbon footprint can actually come up after using great models and all of the data that you have, and give you recommendations to be better at decreasing it and reaching our 2030 ambition. So this is one example out of many where tech can really be used for good.
By the way, I wanted to ask you before I didn't. How much demand are you getting from your marketing colleagues about like, hey, can you set us up a way of like creating like all this content and ads with AI?
So we've worked really hand in hand with the marketing team. So we are in the process of looking at that. We tried to be very thorough into testing where we should apply it first. Like, do you apply it in the origination of the content? Do you look at localization? Do you use that adaptation and transcreation? And we set our eyes onto doing it in a few of those steps. So now we are very close to industrialize like AI generated content with a set of very specific rules. For instance, we don't want to modify too much when it's around a human. We want to make sure that we really look at backgrounds and colors and action items and things like that. Although that will evolve. And I have to say to your question, because I fully get where you're coming from. Probably the first 6 months, where we saw ChatGPT coming up and really like coming up to the public, we had 5, 6 proper discussions around a tech partner somewhere outside saying they can do everything, and whether or not we should go full scale, where we could test, where we could do a POC or a pilot. So we've had a lot of those conversations, but I'm luckily enough, I'm working with people who really are into a marathon, not a sprint. And we looked at, okay, what are the basics that we need to get in place if we really want to do that at scale?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that in your job, you've been good at managing expectations, no?
I mean, that's probably like going all the way back to the previous conversation of being on the dark side of IT. A lot of the job is to say no and to explain why. So that when we actually do it, we do it properly. So yes.
So I wanted to ask you, with all these no's that you've had to give during your career, all these learning experiences, if you went back to like yourself when you were starting and you had to give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
One, I think learning is the only thing that gets you through change of industry, change of context, change of landscape, change of tech. I mean, then really pick the right alignment of opportunity for work where you raise your hand. and who you work for. I've been able to learn so much and therefore go to the next opportunity to do something because I was enabled by my manager, by my leaders, to actually raise my hands and do it. I think it's 50% of the job.
Yeah, totally. Well, really enjoyed this chat, Bastien, from being you and we've talked about that before, but like an unusual specimen of like going from retail to consumer goods and not the other way around, which has ended up with you having a very long title. But I liked how you're doing both innovation from like a global level, but also like making it happen in emerging markets, which is not a small thing. You feel like you talked about like AI and tech as a way to simplify things to create more value. You mentioned also that you like to ask a lot of questions. You also now said that you like to give a lot of no's and explaining why. So I think it must be like a constant dialogue. Also, you talked about the change, like when you do transformation, 70% is people, 20% is data, and 10% is tech. So tech is only 10% tech at the end of the day. It was interesting to talk briefly about the ad tech space as well and how it's evolving, because there's a lot of conversation. I do recommend you listen to that podcast we did recently. You talked also about tech as a way of doing better brand performance. And it was interesting how you said that in terms of like implementing, you get low resistance from the people that are actually using the tech, which I think is cool. And we talked also about leadership and how you enjoy people coming to you with ideas, and that Reckitt's culture has really enabled that, which is good to hear also that you're keeping that DNA alive. And also we talked finally about some impact on sustainability. So I'll be interested to see the results of that in the coming years, because I'm sure it will be a topic that will soon return into, because it's still happening, but it will still return to the front pages. So I hope you enjoyed the chat as well, Bastien.
I genuinely enjoy our conversation, and that's a great summary of the conversation you just made here. I'd say maybe if you allow me one last comment is and back, and so that's me stealing the fact that you asked me one advice, but I give two. What has helped me a lot in everything I've done across industries, function, IT, and so on is always to think in cycles, because I think it's really hard. If you would have told me when I was 20 something, what do you want to do? What's the title? What's the job? What's the company? What you're doing? It would have been impossible to guess what I'm doing right now. So I think thinking of cycles and just looking at, okay, what's your next 2-3 years delivery? What do you learn into that delivery? And then potentially where does it get you next? Is I think the only way to navigate in a constantly changing world, at least for me.
Do you think it's harder to think in cycles when you're getting like headhunter calls very constantly that are offering you different things? How do you balance that?
I actually think that helps, because if you get into a cycle and you're committed to delivering something, I think it helps keeping you in line with why you get into that cycle.
Excellent, Bastien. Really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks to our audience for tuning in again. And we'll see you in the next episode of the FMCG Guys every Wednesday and every Saturday. Have a great one.
The content in this podcast episode is provided for general informational purposes only. By listening to our episode, you understand that no information contained in this episode should be construed as advice from Dwyer Partners SL, doing business as the FMCG Guys, or the individual author, host, or guests, nor is it intended to be a substitute for research on any subject matter. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Dwyer Partners SL. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Dwyer Partners SL expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, or inability to use this podcast or the information we presented in this podcast.